There is a moment, before words, before thought, before you remember who you need to be today. That moment exists in you every morning, and most people move through it asleep, even with their eyes wide open. A few days ago, I woke up with a feeling I couldn't name. It wasn't anxiety. It wasn't joy. It was a dense silence, as if the universe had paused specifically so I would pay attention to something it had been trying to show me for months. I stayed still, didn't reach for my phone, didn't try to understand. I just stayed there with it in that space between waking and beginning. And it was exactly in that interval that I noticed something that completely changed the way I understand manifestation. It's not a technique. It never was. Manifestation is not a set of steps you execute with enough discipline until the universe gives in. That's a distortion. A simplification so extreme it became a trap for an absurd number of people who genuinely want to transform their lives. I know this because I was one of those people. I had applied every method that existed. I visualized, affirmed, wrote it down, gave thanks before receiving, and even doing everything right, something didn't fit. It wasn't in the steps. It was in me. And that in me took a while to understand because it isn't obvious. It doesn't show up when you're busy trying to improve. It only shows up when you stop trying and start listening. There is a woman named Victoria, 36 years old, short hair, the kind of person who, when she smiles, closes her eyes slightly, as if she needed to keep the smile to herself before sharing it with anyone. She told me once that she woke up every single day with a mental list already formed before her feet even touched the floor. Appointments, worries, what she still hadn't managed to change, what she should try differently today. And she said all of this without realizing she was describing a prison. Not an external prison. One she had built herself, brick by brick, with the best of intentions. Because Victoria wasn't a disorganized person or someone lacking willpower. She was someone who had learned that existing correctly required constant effort. And that belief, installed so deep it felt like truth, was exactly what prevented any real change from lasting. Effort wasn't the path. It was the obstacle. I understand that might sound strange. We were taught, by life, by experience, sometimes by the people we love most, that achieving something requires struggle, that transformation hurts, that if it isn't hard, it probably isn't working. And there's a part of that which is true. There is. But there is an enormous difference between the difficulty that comes from growth and the suffering that comes from resistance. One expands you. The other keeps you exactly where you are, just more exhausted. Quantum manifestation, and I want you to understand this differently than you probably have before, doesn't operate in the field of effort. It operates in the field of state, your internal state, the frequency you carry not when you're trying to manifest, but when you're simply being. And here's something very few people notice. You don't attract what you want. You attract what you are. Not as judgment, as physics, as something as neutral as gravity. And the problem is that most people spend the entire day trying to want the right things, visualize the right things, say the right things, while underneath all of that, at the most fundamental level of being, they still carry an identity that doesn't recognize what it's asking for. There's this tension, this request pulling in one direction and this being pulling in another. And life becomes this strange thing, full of attempts, full of good intention, but with a persistent feeling that you are rowing against a current that never stops. But what is this divine spark I keep mentioning? Let me try to tell you in the most honest way I can. It's not a religious concept. It's not a pretty metaphor that works well in a script. It's a perception real, alive, felt in the body, that there is something in you that precedes any story you've ever told about yourself. Something that was there before the first disappointment. Before the first time you learned you needed to be different from what you were. Before any constructed version of you. That spark doesn't disappear when life gets complicated. It just gets covered, layered over with adaptation, self-preservation, identities you took on to survive in contexts that demanded specific performances from you. And the awakening, what I call awakening, is not a dramatic turning point. It's not a moment of illumination with blinding light and sudden revelation. It's more subtle than that. It's a morning when you wake up and, for a fraction of a second before remembering everything you have to do, you feel something clean. Something that doesn't depend on any external condition to exist. And you recognize it, not as something new, as something ancient, as something that was always yours and that you had simply stopped visiting. The question is, what happens after that moment? Because most people feel this, that flash of clarity, that instant of genuine peace, and immediately let the mind in. The thoughts arrive. The list arrives. The worry arrives. And that state dissolves before you have time to understand what it was. What I discovered, and what changed the way I begin every day, is that this moment doesn't have to be wasted, can be inhabited. Not prolonged by force, not held with effort, inhabited, with presence, with a kind of gentle attention that doesn't try to control what it's feeling, only observes. When you begin your morning in that state, before the phone, before the notifications, before any demand, you're not just having a beautiful moment. You are anchoring an identity. You are telling your deepest structure. This is the starting point. Not chaos, not urgency, not the weight of what hasn't been resolved yet. Peace, alignment, presence. And when that is the foundation of your day, something begins to change. Not explosively, not overnight, silently. Decisions feel different. Perceptions feel different. Doors you couldn't even see start appearing in your field of vision. Not because the universe decided to reward you, but because you started operating from a state that can recognize what was always available. I know that might seem too simple to be true. We want transformation to be complex because complexity justifies the difficulty. If it's hard, at least it makes sense that it hasn't worked yet. But what if the simplicity were real? What if what separates you from a life that makes sense isn't more effort, more technique, more willpower, but a different quality of presence with yourself? I'm not saying there's no work involved. There is. But the work that transforms is different from the work that wears you down. One is born from alignment. The other is born from fear. And you can tell the difference when you stop long enough to feel where each action is coming from. That's what Victoria learned. Not suddenly. Not in a straight line. She started waking up 5 minutes earlier, not to meditate with perfect technique, not to repeat affirmations in a notebook, just to be still. Staring at the ceiling. Breathing. Letting the morning silence exist before she filled that space with productivity. And she told me that in the first few days it felt pointless. That her mind wouldn't stop. That the list showed up anyway. That she lay there wondering if she was doing it right. But she kept going. And at some point, she can't say exactly when, the silence started answering. Not with words. With a feeling. With that quality of knowing that doesn't need an argument to exist. And things in her life started rearranging. Not because she asked with more intensity, but because she stopped internally contradicting what she was externally desiring. The identity began to shift. And when identity shifts, the field shifts. That is quantum manifestation at its most real. It's not what you do. It's who you are while you do it. It's the state you carry while you live. And that state isn't built from the outside. It's accessed from within. It already exists in you. It always has. You just need to stop moving away from it at the same speed it tries to emerge. There is a difference between wanting to change and being ready to be different. Wanting to change still belongs to the old self. It's the old self looking at the future and wishing for another version. Being ready to be different is another level entirely. It's a permission you give yourself to begin operating from an identity that doesn't yet have all the history to justify itself, but that you feel to be true. That's the shift no one teaches properly, because it isn't a technique. It's a deep-level choice. A choice that needs to be renewed, not every hour, not with compulsive effort, but with awareness, with gentleness, with the same patience you would have for someone you love who is learning something new. You are that someone, right now, not the future version who will have conquered everything. The current version, with all the open questions, with all the things still unresolved. This version deserves to be treated as someone who already carries what they need. Because they do. The spark isn't something you'll find when you finally get there. It's what illuminates the path while you walk it. And it's already lit. It always was. What changes when you wake up to this, when you truly wake up, not as a concept but as a felt experience, is that you stop living in a constant state of searching. You start living in a state of recognition. And recognition is completely different from conquering. Recognition is light. It's natural. It's like remembering something you always knew but had forgotten. And that forgetting is not your fault. Life creates conditions that pull us away from ourselves. Pressures, expectations, accumulated pain, years of reshaping who we are to fit into spaces that were designed for a different shape. But the distance doesn't erase what's inside. And the return, that return to yourself, can begin on an ordinary morning. Can begin with 5 minutes of silence before the mind takes over. It can begin with a question you ask yourself before getting out of bed. Who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when I don't need to prove anything? Who am I when the performance stops? That answer, the real answer, not the one you built to protect yourself, is the starting point of everything. Of every real manifestation. Of every change that lasts. Of every life that finally makes sense, not because the external conditions align perfectly, but because you and yourself are finally moving in the same direction. The divine spark awakens was born from the need to go beyond manifestation techniques. It was created to help you find and sustain that internal state of peace, presence, and alignment where changes happen naturally. More than learning something new, it's an invitation to reconnect with who you truly are, allowing a silent, deep, and genuine transformation of your identity. It's not mandatory. It's not for everyone, and I say that with respect. It's for those who feel in their heart that the change they're looking for isn't in the next technique, but in a truer layer of themselves. It's the natural continuation of this inner journey. For those who feel the moment is now. If this resonated with you, the link is in the pinned comment. Write in the comments your name, just your name, and one word. A single word that describes what you're carrying right now. It doesn't need to be beautiful. It doesn't need to make sense to anyone else. It just needs to be true. Because that simple gesture, putting into words what lives inside, is already a beginning. Already a choice of presence. And presence is everything. I'm Daniel, and this conversation doesn't end here.